Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your worst relationship look like a fairy tale. Picture this. You're 13 years old, and your father just sold you to a 40-year-old stranger for 3 cows and a plot of land. Welcome to medieval marriage, where love was considered a mental illness, and your wedding night involved an audience of drunk relatives cheering from the corner of your bedroom. You probably think you know what marriage was like back then. Maybe some arranged unions, a bit of formality, perhaps less romance than today. But you're not prepared for the reality. Medieval marriage wasn't just unromantic. It was a systematic destruction of human autonomy that would make modern human trafficking laws seem quaint. The church called it holy matrimony, but it functioned more like legalized slavery with a religious blessing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, all of us united in our fascination with humanity's darker chapters. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a medieval marketplace, and the air reeks of unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables, and something else: desperation. That young girl being dragged toward the church isn't going to her first communion. She's about to become someone's property, and the transaction happening behind her involves more haggling than buying a horse. Her father counts coins while her future husband examines her teeth like livestock. This isn't love, it's commerce, and she's the commodity. Medieval society viewed romantic love as a dangerous disruption to the natural order. The concept of marrying for affection was considered not just foolish, but actively harmful to family stability and social structure. Love, they believed, made people irrational, unpredictable, and likely to make decisions that benefited themselves rather than their family's political and economic interests. A woman who claimed to love her intended husband was viewed with suspicion. Clearly, she wasn't thinking clearly. The average age of marriage for girls hovered around 14, though betrothals could happen much earlier. Boys typically married in their early 20s, giving them time to establish some economic foundation before taking on a wife and the inevitable children. But here's the twist that'll make your skin crawl. The age gap wasn't accidental. Older husbands were considered better able to control young wives, and a significant age difference was seen as insurance against the wife developing too much independence or, God forbid, falling in love with someone her own age. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely convinced that love was dangerous, or if they simply used this philosophy to justify an economic system that treated women like valuable livestock. The evidence suggests both were true. The ideology served the system, and the system reinforced the ideology in a perfect circle of oppression. Your typical medieval wedding wasn't the romantic ceremony you might imagine. It was a business transaction with religious decoration, where the bride's consent was often assumed rather than requested. The phrase "speak now or forever hold your peace" wasn't romantic drama. It was a legal requirement to ensure no one had a prior claim on the human property being transferred. The bride's silence was taken as agreement, even if she'd been threatened, drugged, or simply paralyzed with terror. The wedding feast that followed was less celebration than corporate merger announcement. Families displayed their wealth, negotiated future business dealings, and publicly celebrated the successful transfer of assets, including the bride herself. The girl who'd been playing with dolls months earlier was now expected to manage a household, bear children, and submit to a stranger's will in all things. Medieval marriage wasn't a partnership. It was an ownership transfer with a religious blessing and a really expensive party. You're 7 years old, playing in the dirt outside your family's manor, when your father calls you inside with an expression that makes your stomach drop. Sitting in the great hall is a man older than your grandfather, his clothes rich but his breath reeking of wine and decay. Your father's hand on your shoulder feels heavier than usual as he announces your engagement to this stranger. Congratulations! Just entered the nightmare world of childhood betrothal, where your future was decided before you could even spell your own name. Medieval childhood ended the moment families saw economic opportunity in their offspring. Children as young as 5 were routinely promised in marriage, their tiny hands guided to make marks on contracts they couldn't read, sealing fates they couldn't comprehend. The practice was so common that canon law eventually had to set minimum ages, 12 for girls, 14 for boys. But these were often ignored when sufficient money was involved. Your childhood wasn't a time for play and learning. It was a brief period before you became a valuable commodity in your family's business portfolio. The negotiation process resembled a livestock auction more than anything romantic. Families would literally inspect potential brides like prize cattle, examining teeth, checking for physical deformities, and discussing breeding potential with the casual detachment of horse traders. A girl's value was calculated based on her family's wealth, her physical appearance, her health, and her likelihood of producing male heirs. Her personality, intelligence, or preferences were not just irrelevant. They were potentially problematic complications to an otherwise straightforward business deal. Dowries were the medieval equivalent of paying someone to take your daughter off your hands, except the payment could bankrupt entire families. A typical dowry might include land, livestock, household goods, money, and sometimes even servants. Families would go into crushing debt to marry off daughters, viewing it as a necessary investment in their social standing. The pressure was so intense that some families would enter into dowry agreements before their daughters were even born, essentially selling futures contracts on unborn children. The betrothal ceremony itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation disguised as religious ritual. Children, too, young to understand the implications, would be dressed in their finest clothes, coached on what to say, and paraded before witnesses who would later testify that the union was legitimate. The child's consent was assumed from their failure to object, as if a 7-year-old had the emotional or intellectual capacity to understand what they were agreeing to, let alone the social power to refuse. Here's where it gets particularly twisted. These childhood betrothals were legally binding contracts that could only be broken under very specific circumstances. A family that tried to back out faced not just social disgrace, but potential legal action for breach of contract. The children involved had no legal standing to object, even as they grew older and developed their own preferences. They were bound by agreements made when they were barely out of diapers, trapped in futures they never chose. The waiting period between betrothal and marriage was its own special form of torture. Young girls would be sent to live with their future husband's family, essentially becoming unpaid servants while being groomed for their eventual role as wives. They'd be taught household management, religious duties, and the fine art of submission to male authority. Any sign of rebellion or independence was quickly crushed. After all, they were training to become property, not partners. Historians still argue whether parents genuinely believed these arrangements were in their children's best interests, or if they simply prioritized family advancement over individual happiness. The evidence suggests most parents convinced themselves they were securing their children's futures, even as they destroyed their children's autonomy. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Loving parents who would simultaneously protect their children from physical harm, while emotionally and psychologically devastating them through forced marriage arrangements. The most heartbreaking aspect was how these children adapted to their circumstances. Many developed a form of learned helplessness, accepting their fate with resignation that adults interpreted as maturity and wisdom. Others rebelled in small ways, refusing to eat, developing mysterious illnesses, or displaying behavioral problems that were typically punished rather than understood as cries for help. The lucky few found ways to delay or escape their arrangements, but they were rare exceptions in a system designed to crush individual will. Some families tried to soften the blow by arranging marriages between children who were close in age or had grown up together, hoping familiarity would breed affection. But even these kinder arrangements were still fundamentally about property transfer rather than human happiness. The children involved might develop genuine fondness for each other, but they'd never know if their feelings were real or simply Stockholm Syndrome with a religious blessing. You're watching your father pace the great hall like a caged animal, muttering calculations under his breath, while your mother weeps quietly in the corner. The dowry demands have arrived, and they're astronomical, more than your family's entire annual income. Welcome to the medieval dowry trap, where marrying off a daughter could mean financial ruin, but not marrying her off meant social death. Either way, your family was probably screwed. The dowry system was economic warfare disguised as tradition, a brutal game where families bankrupted themselves to maintain social standing. A typical dowry might include cash equivalent to several years' income, household furnishings, livestock, land, and sometimes even servants or slaves. The groom's family would present their demands like a shopping list from hell, knowing that refusing meant their daughter would remain unmarried, a fate worse than poverty in medieval society. Families would mortgage their lands, sell their possessions, and borrow money at crushing interest rates to meet dowry demands. Some parents started saving for their daughters' dowries from the moment of birth, setting aside every spare coin for decades. Others would arrange marriages for their sons specifically to gain dowry income that could then be used to marry off their daughters. A Ponzi scheme of matrimonial finance that kept everyone trapped in cycles of debt and desperation. The negotiation process was a masterclass in medieval extortion. The groom's family would start with outrageous demands, knowing they'd eventually negotiate down to merely ruinous amounts. They'd inspect the proposed dowry goods like suspicious merchants, rejecting items that weren't valuable enough and demanding upgrades that sent costs spiraling higher. A cow that seemed adequate might be deemed too old, requiring the bride's family to purchase a younger, more expensive replacement. Household linens might be rejected as insufficiently fine, forcing families to buy luxury items they couldn't afford. Here's the truly diabolical part. Dowry inflation was a real economic phenomenon. As families competed to secure the best marriages for their daughters, dowry amounts kept rising, creating an arms race of matrimonial spending that devastated entire communities. What had been considered an adequate dowry, one generation became laughably insufficient the next, forcing families to constantly increase their financial commitments just to keep up with social expectations. The pressure was so intense that some families would enter into dowry agreements they knew they couldn't fulfill, hoping to find the money somehow before the wedding date. This led to a secondary market in dowry loans, where moneylenders specialized in matrimonial debt at interest rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. Families would mortgage their futures for their daughters' weddings, often spending decades paying off the debt from a single ceremony. Multiple daughters meant multiple financial disasters. Families with several girls faced the terrifying prospect of serial bankruptcies, each wedding pushing them deeper into debt. Some parents would arrange marriages for their daughters in order of dowry affordability rather than age, marrying off the daughter who required the smallest payment first, while desperately trying to accumulate resources for the others. Sisters would sometimes remain unmarried for years, waiting for their families to recover financially from their siblings' weddings. The dowry trap created a vicious cycle where families needed wealthy sons-in-law to help pay for their daughters' marriages, but wealthy men demanded larger dowries, making the problem worse rather than better. Poor families were essentially locked out of the marriage market entirely, their daughters condemned to spinsterhood not because they were undesirable, but because their families couldn't afford the entry fee to the matrimonial economy. Historians still argue whether the dowry system was primarily about ensuring women's financial security, or simply a method for transferring wealth between male-controlled families. The evidence suggests it was mostly the latter. Women rarely had control over their dowry assets after marriage, and the money typically became their husband's property to use as he saw fit. The dowry was supposed to provide for the wife's needs, but in practice, it often disappeared into the husband's general finances. Some families tried creative solutions to the dowry problem. They'd arrange marriages between families of similar economic status, essentially trading daughters and dowries in a way that minimized cash outflow. Others would send daughters to convents instead of arranging marriages, paying a smaller dowry to the church rather than a crushing amount to a husband's family. But these alternatives were often seen as admissions of financial failure, carrying their own social stigma. The most desperate families would sometimes arrange marriages with significantly older men or widowers, who typically demanded smaller dowries in exchange for taking wives who might not have many childbearing years left. These arrangements were often the only option for families who couldn't afford the premium prices demanded for young. You're lying in bed on your wedding night, but you're not alone, and not in the way you might hope. The room is packed with drunk relatives, church officials, and family friends, all waiting to witness the consummation of your marriage. Someone's holding a candle uncomfortably close to the bed, while your new husband fumbles with his clothes, and everyone's offering helpful commentary like this is some sort of medieval sporting event. Welcome to the wedding night from hell, where privacy was a luxury no one could afford, and your most intimate moment became public entertainment. The medieval bedding ceremony was psychological torture disguised as religious tradition. The logic was simple. Marriage wasn't legally complete until consummation, and consummation needed witnesses to prevent later claims of non-fulfillment. What this meant in practice was that terrified young brides had to perform their most vulnerable moments in front of audiences that might include their own parents, in-laws, local clergy, and various family friends who'd had too much wedding ale. The ceremony began with the blessing of the bed, where religious officials would sprinkle holy water on the mattress and recite prayers for fertility, while the bride and groom stood nearby in their night clothes. The crowd would then escort the couple to bed, offering advice, making jokes, and generally treating the whole affair like a combination religious service and comedy show. The bride's terror was often mistaken for modesty, while the groom's nervousness was seen as charming inexperience. Here's where it gets particularly nightmarish. The witnesses didn't just watch the preliminaries and leave. They stayed to confirm that penetration had actually occurred, sometimes requiring physical evidence like blood-stained sheets to prove the bride's virginity had been properly transferred to her new husband. The sheets would be examined, displayed, and sometimes even preserved as legal documentation of the marriage's consummation. Your most private moment became a matter of public record. The pressure on young brides was unimaginable. Many were barely teenagers, completely ignorant about sex, and suddenly expected to perform intimate acts in front of crowds while their husbands, often strangers they'd met days or weeks earlier, fumbled through their own inexperience. The combination of physical pain, emotional trauma, and public humiliation created psychological scars that lasted lifetimes. Some brides fainted from terror, which was often interpreted as maidenly delicacy rather than genuine distress. The grooms faced their own pressures, though they were generally older and more experienced. Failure to perform in front of an audience could lead to questions about the marriage's validity, rumors about impotence, and potential annulment proceedings. Some men would drink heavily before the ceremony to calm their nerves, which often made the experience even more traumatic for their wives. The whole system was designed to prioritize legal certainty over human dignity. Wealthy families sometimes hired professional witnesses, usually older women experienced in confirming consummation, to provide expert testimony about the proceedings. These women would examine the bride before and after the ceremony, checking for signs of virginity and its loss with the clinical detachment of medieval gynecologists. Their reports could make or break a marriage's legal standing, giving them enormous power over young couples' futures. The church tried to regulate the worst excesses of bedding ceremonies, occasionally issuing guidelines about appropriate witness numbers and behavior. But enforcement was spotty, and local customs often trumped religious authority. Some regions developed elaborate rituals around the bedding ceremony, turning it into a community celebration that could last hours. The couple's comfort and consent were secondary considerations to the community's need for entertainment and legal certainty. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed public consummation was necessary for valid marriage, or if the practice persisted because it served other social functions like community bonding and power display. The evidence suggests both factors were important. Legal concerns provided the justification, while social dynamics provided the motivation to maintain such an obviously traumatic practice. Some couples tried to minimize the trauma by arranging private ceremonies with minimal witnesses, but this was risky. A marriage that couldn't be proven consummated could be annulled, leaving the bride in legal limbo and her family responsible for returning the dowry. The safer approach was to endure the public humiliation and get it over with, knowing that resistance might lead to even worse consequences. The psychological impact of these ceremonies extended far beyond the wedding night. Many couples never recovered from the trauma of beginning their intimate relationship as public performance. The association between sex and humiliation, between privacy and shame, shaped medieval attitudes toward marital intimacy in ways that persisted for generations. Love might eventually develop between spouses, but it had to overcome the brutal beginning imposed by social custom and legal requirement. You're watching your neighbor being dragged through the streets, her head shaved and a scarlet letter sewn onto her dress, while her husband walks freely beside his pregnant mistress. She committed adultery and faces public humiliation, possible death, and permanent social exile. He committed adultery and faces, well, nothing really. Welcome to medieval justice, where the same crime carried vastly different punishments depending on whether you had male or female anatomy, and where a woman's sexual transgression could literally be a death sentence while a man's was barely worth mentioning. The punishment for female adultery was designed to be both physically devastating and psychologically destroying. Public humiliation was just the beginning. Adulterous women might have their heads shaved to mark them as sexual criminals, be forced to wear distinctive clothing that identified their sin, or be paraded through town while crowds threw garbage and stones. The goal wasn't just punishment but permanent marking, ensuring that everyone would know about their transgression for the rest of their lives. In many regions, adulterous women faced actual death sentences, and the methods were deliberately chosen to maximize suffering and public spectacle. Burning was common, as it was considered appropriate for crimes that were both sexual and spiritual in nature. Drowning was another popular method, sometimes carried out by tying the woman in a sack and throwing her into a river while the community watched. Some areas preferred stoning, which allowed the entire community to participate in the execution and demonstrate their moral outrage. Here's the part that reveals the true nature of medieval misogyny. The punishments weren't really about adultery. They were about property rights and male honor. A woman who committed adultery was considered to have damaged her husband's property, herself, and potentially corrupted his bloodline by introducing illegitimate children. The severity of punishment was directly related to how much her actions threatened male economic and social interests, not to any abstract moral principle about sexual fidelity. The legal framework surrounding adultery was sophisticated in its discrimination. Church law, civil law, and customary law all distinguished between male and female sexual transgression, creating a system where identical actions carried completely different consequences based solely on gender. A man who slept with a married woman was guilty of a relatively minor sin. A married woman who slept with anyone other than her husband was guilty of a crime that could justify execution. The evidence requirements for proving adultery were also heavily gendered. A woman could be convicted of adultery based on circumstantial evidence, rumors, or even just being seen alone with a man who wasn't her husband. Men, on the other hand, typically had to be caught in the act with multiple witnesses, and even then, the punishment was usually limited to church penance rather than civil penalties. The legal system was designed to make it easy to convict women and difficult to convict men. Some regions developed particularly creative forms of ongoing punishment for adulterous women who weren't executed. They might be required to attend church services wearing special clothing that identified their sin, ensuring that their shame was renewed weekly in front of the entire community. Others were banned from certain areas of town, forbidden from participating in community celebrations, or required to perform public penance that could last for years. The economic consequences of adultery accusations were devastating for women and their families. An adulterous woman lost all property rights, and her dowry typically reverted to her husband or his family. Her children might be declared illegitimate, losing their inheritance rights and social standing. Her family of origin often disowned her to avoid being associated with her shame, leaving her completely without support or resources. The double standard extended to the treatment of the adultery partners. A man who slept with a married woman might face mild social disapproval, but his reputation, property, and family relationships remained largely intact. A woman who slept with a married man faced the same severe punishments as if she had been the married party, even if she was single. The system held women responsible for male sexual behavior while excusing men for female sexual choices. Historians still argue whether medieval adultery punishments were primarily about religious morality or secular social control. The evidence suggests that religious justifications were used to support a system that was fundamentally about maintaining male authority and property rights. The church provided the moral framework, but the actual implementation served economic and political interests rather than spiritual ones. Some women tried to use the adultery laws strategically, making false accusations against rivals or enemies. But this was extremely dangerous, as false accusations could backfire and result in punishment for the accuser. The legal system was designed to favor men's testimony over women's, making it difficult for women to use adultery charges as weapons even when they had legitimate grievances. The psychological impact of the adultery double standard extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. All women lived with the knowledge that a single sexual mistake could destroy their lives, while men faced minimal consequences for similar behavior. This created a climate of fear and resentment that poisoned relationships between spouses and made genuine intimacy difficult to achieve. The most tragic aspect was how the system turned women against each other. Wives were encouraged to spy on and report other women's sexual behavior, creating networks of surveillance and betrayal that destroyed female solidarity. Women who might have supported each other against male oppression instead became enforcers of the very system that oppressed them, competing to demonstrate their own virtue by condemning others' supposed sins. The long-term effects of these punishments extended across generations. Children of women who were punished for adultery faced social stigma that could last their entire lives. Families were torn apart. Not you're standing in your husband's counting room, watching him inventory your dowry like livestock, because that's essentially what you've become, a valuable asset with no legal existence of your own. The moment you said, "I do," you ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of the law and became what legal scholars called a femme covert, a covered woman whose legal identity was completely absorbed into her husband's. Welcome to the economic slavery of medieval marriage, where wives were literally property with no more legal rights than their husband's horses or hunting dogs. The doctrine of coverture was the legal foundation that made married women into nonentities. Under this system, a married woman couldn't own property, sign contracts, make wills, or conduct any business in her own name. Everything she had brought to the marriage, land, money, jewelry, even her clothes, became her husband's absolute property the moment the wedding ceremony ended. She couldn't buy or sell anything, couldn't lend or borrow money, and couldn't even give away her own possessions without her husband's explicit permission. Here's where the system gets particularly insidious. Even money that a wife earned through her own labor belonged entirely to her husband. If she worked as a seamstress, brewed ale, or sold goods at market, every penny of her earnings legally belonged to her spouse. She was essentially an unpaid employee in her own life, generating income that she had no right to control or spend. The law treated her labor as her husband's property, just like the work of his servants or livestock. The property implications were staggering and permanent. When a woman married, her family's land holdings could be transferred to her husband's control, sometimes permanently altering the economic landscape of entire regions. Wealthy families would lose ancestral properties through their daughters' marriages, while ambitious men could acquire vast estates simply by marrying well. The bride was essentially a vehicle for property transfer, with no say in how her inheritance was managed or distributed. Legal contracts involving married women required elaborate workarounds that highlighted their non-person status. If a married woman needed to conduct business, her husband had to act as her legal representative, signing documents on her behalf and taking responsibility for any obligations. She couldn't even make a will without his permission, meaning that she had no control over what happened to her possessions after death. Her legal existence was so thoroughly absorbed into her husband's that she couldn't even plan her own funeral without his approval. The economic vulnerability this created was absolute and terrifying. A woman whose husband died suddenly might discover that she had no legal claim to property she had brought to the marriage or helped to acquire during it. Widows could be left destitute even if they had contributed significantly to their family's wealth, because their contributions weren't legally recognized. The system created a class of economically helpless women who were completely dependent on male relatives for survival. Debt was another area where coverture created impossible situations. If a husband accumulated debts, his wife's property could be seized to pay them, even if she had no knowledge of or involvement in creating the obligations. Conversely, if a wife somehow managed to incur debts, which was legally difficult since she couldn't enter contracts, her husband was automatically responsible for paying them. The system made it impossible for women to have independent financial lives, while making them vulnerable to their husband's financial mistakes. The psychological impact of economic non-existence was devastating. Women who had grown up managing family businesses or overseeing large households suddenly found themselves unable to make the simplest financial decisions. The transition from economic agency to complete dependence was jarring and demoralizing, creating a sense of helplessness that extended far beyond financial matters. Many women described feeling like they had died and been reborn as someone else's shadow. Historians still argue whether coverture was primarily designed to protect women by making their husbands responsible for their welfare, or whether it was simply a method for transferring wealth and power from women to men. The evidence strongly suggests the latter. The system consistently benefited men at women's expense, and the supposed protections it offered were largely theoretical rather than practical. Some wealthy families tried to work around coverture through elaborate legal arrangements like separate estates or trust funds, but these were expensive, complex, and often ineffective. The legal system was designed to favor husbands' rights over wives' interests, and even the most sophisticated legal protections could be challenged or overturned. Most families simply accepted that marriage meant the permanent transfer of their daughter's economic independence to their sons-in-law. The business implications were enormous for families that depended on women's economic contributions. A successful female merchant or craftswoman would lose the ability to continue her trade independently after marriage, potentially destroying businesses that had taken years to build. Some couples tried to maintain the fiction of the wife's independent business activities, but this was legally risky and could result in serious penalties if discovered. The international trade implications were also significant, as coverture laws varied between regions and could create complex legal problems for merchant families. A woman who had property rights in one jurisdiction might lose them entirely if she married someone from a region with stricter coverture laws. These legal differences could make or break international business relationships, and sometimes influenced marriage negotiations as much as dowry considerations. The most heartbreaking aspect was how coverture affected women's relationships with their own children. Since married women couldn't own property, they had no economic resources to leave to their children independently of their husband's wishes. A mother couldn't set aside money for her daughter's dowry or her son's education without her husband's permission and cooperation. The system made it impossible for women to provide for their children's futures, creating another layer of dependence. You're walking through a village that reeks of death, stepping over corpses that no one has the strength to bury, and you notice something strange. The few surviving women are suddenly negotiating their own marriages, demanding higher wages, and refusing arrangements they would never have dared question before the plague arrived. The Black Death didn't just kill 1/3 of Europe's population. It accidentally created the first major crack in the medieval marriage system by making women scarce enough to have actual bargaining power for the first time in centuries. The demographic catastrophe of the plague years created an unprecedented labor shortage that temporarily upended every social convention, including marriage arrangements. With so many people dead, surviving women found themselves in the bizarre position of being valuable not just as wives and mothers, but as workers whose labor was desperately needed. For a brief, shining moment in medieval history, supply and demand actually worked in women's favor, giving them leverage they had never possessed before and would not possess again for centuries. The marriage market transformed overnight from a buyer's market to a seller's market, with families of eligible women suddenly able to make demands that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Dowry requirements dropped dramatically as desperate men competed for the limited number of available brides. Some women were able to negotiate marriage contracts that included unusual provisions like retaining control over their property, having a say in where they lived, or even maintaining their own businesses after marriage. Here's where the plague's impact gets particularly interesting. The massive death toll created thousands of young widows who inherited their husbands' property and businesses, suddenly finding themselves in control of significant wealth and economic enterprises. These women had a choice: remarry quickly and lose their independence, or try to maintain their businesses and property as single women. Many chose the latter, creating a temporary class of economically independent women that medieval society had never seen before. The church's response to this female empowerment was swift and harsh. Religious authorities recognized that the plague-induced changes threatened the entire social order, and they launched campaigns to restore traditional marriage arrangements as quickly as possible. Sermons emphasized women's duty to remarry and submit to male authority, while church courts began strictly enforcing laws that had been more loosely applied during the crisis years. The labor shortage also meant that women could demand higher wages for their work, giving them economic independence that translated into marriage independence. A woman who could support herself through brewing, textile work, or other trades didn't need to accept the first marriage proposal that came along. Some women used their increased earning power to delay marriage for years, enjoying a freedom that their mothers and grandmothers had never experienced. The psychological impact of this temporary empowerment was profound and lasting. Women who had experienced economic independence and decision-making authority during the plague years never fully accepted their return to traditional subordination. They passed stories of their brief freedom to their daughters, creating underground networks of female resistance that would persist for generations. The plague had shown that alternative arrangements were possible, even if they weren't sustainable. Regional variations in plague mortality created different outcomes for women's status across Europe. Areas that lost higher percentages of their male population saw more dramatic improvements in women's bargaining power, while regions with more balanced mortality rates maintained traditional marriage patterns. These differences created a patchwork of women's rights that varied dramatically from one area to another. The economic disruption caused by the plague also affected dowry practices in complex ways. While some families found themselves unable to provide traditional dowries due to economic losses, others discovered that their surviving daughters were so valuable that dowries became unnecessary or even reversed, with grooms' families paying bride prices instead of receiving dowries. These changes challenged fundamental assumptions about women's economic value and marriage negotiations. Historians still argue whether the plague's impact on women's status was primarily positive or negative, as the demographic catastrophe also created new vulnerabilities and dangers. While some women gained temporary independence, others found themselves completely without protection in a world where traditional support systems had collapsed. The evidence suggests that the plague's effects were highly variable, benefiting some women while devastating others. The nobility's response to changing marriage patterns was particularly revealing. Aristocratic families, who had the most to lose from disruptions to traditional marriage alliances, worked aggressively to restore pre-plague arrangements. They used their remaining wealth and political power to pressure lower-class families back into traditional patterns, essentially subsidizing the return to female subordination through economic incentives and threats. The urban-rural divide became more pronounced during the plague years, as cities offered more opportunities for women's economic independence, while rural areas maintained more traditional structures. Urban women could find work in trades that had previously been male-dominated, while rural women were more likely to be pressured back into traditional marriages as soon as the immediate crisis passed. The most significant long-term impact was how the plague years demonstrated that marriage arrangements were social constructions rather than natural laws. Women who had experienced alternatives to traditional marriage patterns never fully accepted the inevitability of their subordination. This created a legacy of resistance that would influence women's attitudes toward marriage for generations, even as the immediate gains of the plague years were gradually eroded. The backlash against women's temporary empowerment was systematic and thorough. Laws were passed to restrict women's economic activities. Guild membership was limited to exclude women who had gained entry during the labor shortage, and marriage laws were strengthened to prevent the kinds of negotiations that had become common during the plague years. Society worked deliberately to erase the gains women had made. You're attending 2 weddings on the same day, and the contrast is so stark it's like witnessing events from different centuries. In the morning, you watch a 12-year-old duchess being married to a foreign prince she's never met, surrounded by hundreds of nobles who have spent months negotiating every detail of the political alliance. In the afternoon, you see a peasant couple who have been living together for years finally getting their union blessed by the local priest, with their 3 children playing at their feet. Welcome to the bizarre world of medieval marriage, where your social class didn't just determine your wealth, it determined whether your wedding was a political transaction or something resembling actual human choice. Noble marriages were elaborate political theater designed to cement alliances, transfer territories, and consolidate power between ruling families. These weren't romantic unions, but diplomatic treaties sealed with human sacrifice, where the bride and groom were essentially hostages exchanged to guarantee their families' cooperation. The negotiations could take years and involved not just dowries and bride prices, but complex agreements about military support, trade rights, territorial claims, and succession laws that would affect entire kingdoms. The age disparities in noble marriages were often grotesque, with political considerations completely overriding human decency. A 40-year-old duke might marry an 8-year-old princess to secure an alliance, with the understanding that consummation would be delayed until she reached puberty, though puberty was often defined as the first sign of menstruation, regardless of the girl's physical or emotional readiness. These child brides would be sent to foreign courts where they knew no one, spoke different languages, and had no allies or protection. Here's where noble marriage gets particularly twisted. The couples often met for the first time at their wedding ceremony, having been negotiated over like livestock by diplomats and family representatives. Their personal compatibility, physical attraction, or emotional connection were completely irrelevant to arrangements that might determine the fate of thousands of people. Some noble couples would spend their entire married lives as strangers, communicating through intermediaries and meeting only for formal occasions and procreation. Peasant marriages, by contrast, were often based on practical considerations that at least allowed for some personal choice and mutual compatibility. While peasant families certainly considered economic factors when arranging marriages, they couldn't afford to ignore whether couples could actually work together, get along, and manage a household effectively. A peasant marriage that didn't function on a personal level could mean starvation, while a dysfunctional noble marriage just meant political inconvenience. The courtship patterns were completely different between social classes. Noble courtship was conducted through formal letters, diplomatic meetings, and elaborate gift exchanges, with the actual couple having minimal direct contact before marriage. Peasant courtship might involve months or years of working together, attending local festivals, and gradually developing relationships that resembled modern dating more than medieval marriage negotiations. The wedding ceremonies themselves reflected these class differences in revealing ways. Noble weddings were massive public spectacles designed to display wealth and power, with hundreds of guests, elaborate feasts, and ceremonies that could last for days. Every detail was choreographed to send political messages about the family's status and the alliance being created. Peasant weddings were simpler affairs, often held in local churches with modest celebrations that focused more on community blessing than political display. The economic implications varied dramatically by social class. Noble marriages involved the transfer of vast estates, titles, and political rights that could reshape entire regions. The dowries and bride prices exchanged in aristocratic marriages could fund armies or build castles. Peasant marriages involved much smaller economic exchanges, perhaps a cow, some household goods, or a small plot of land, but these transfers were often more significant relative to the family's total wealth. The living arrangements after marriage also differed substantially. Noble couples might maintain separate households, live in different countries, or see each other only during formal court seasons. Their marriages were often long-distance relationships managed by correspondence and periodic visits. Peasant couples typically lived together immediately after marriage, sharing daily work and domestic responsibilities in ways that required actual cooperation and compatibility. Historians still argue whether peasant marriages were genuinely more egalitarian than noble marriages, or whether the appearance of choice was simply a result of having fewer resources to fight over. The evidence suggests that while peasant women had more input into their marriage choices, they still faced significant constraints and had limited legal rights once married. The difference was more about degree than fundamental structure. The reproductive expectations also varied by class in important ways. Noble women were expected to produce male heirs to continue family lines and inherit titles, creating enormous pressure around pregnancy and childbirth. Peasant women were expected to have children who could contribute to family labor, but the specific gender and number of children was less politically significant. This created different kinds of stress, but also different kinds of flexibility in family planning. The adultery and divorce patterns reflected class differences as well. Noble adultery was often overlooked if it didn't threaten succession or political alliances, while peasant adultery was more likely to be punished because it threatened household stability and community order. Noble women might have more opportunities for extramarital relationships, but faced more severe consequences if those relationships threatened political arrangements. The most ironic aspect was that peasant marriages, despite being considered socially inferior, often provided more genuine companionship and partnership than their aristocratic counterparts. Peasant couples who worked together daily, shared domestic responsibilities, and faced common challenges often developed relation. You're grinding up mercury with your bare hands, mixing it with lead and arsenic to create a paste that you'll rub on your cervix, hoping it will prevent pregnancy without killing you in the process. Your neighbor swears by jumping backward 7 times after intercourse while holding her breath. And the village wise woman recommends inserting crocodile dung mixed with honey into your womb. Welcome to medieval birth control, where preventing pregnancy required risking death. And the methods were so dangerous that many women preferred to take their chances with potentially fatal childbirth rather than definitely toxic contraception. Medieval contraceptive methods were a horrifying combination of folk wisdom, religious superstition, and accidental poisoning that killed more women than they helped. The most common approach involved inserting various substances into the vagina or uterus, including animal dung, acidic fruit juices, wool soaked in vinegar, and mixtures of herbs that were often highly toxic. These methods were based on the correct understanding that creating a hostile environment in the reproductive tract could prevent pregnancy. But the execution was so primitive and dangerous that the cure was often worse than the condition. The herbal contraceptives were particularly deadly, as medieval women had no way to control dosages or understand the toxic effects of the plants they were consuming. Pennyroyal, tansy, and rue were popular choices for preventing pregnancy, but they were also effective at causing liver failure, kidney damage, and death. Women would brew these herbs into teas, create tinctures, or even insert them directly into their bodies, often with fatal results. The line between contraceptive dose and lethal dose was impossible to determine without modern medical knowledge. Here's where medieval birth control gets particularly desperate. Some methods involved deliberate physical trauma designed to prevent implantation or cause early miscarriage. Women would lift heavy objects immediately after intercourse, jump from heights, or even have others punch them in the abdomen, believing that physical shock could prevent pregnancy. These methods occasionally worked, but they also caused internal injuries, broken bones, and sometimes death from internal bleeding. The religious prohibition on contraception made the situation even more dangerous by forcing women to seek help from underground networks of folk healers and wise women who operated outside official medical supervision. These practitioners often had some genuine knowledge passed down through generations of women, but they also perpetuated dangerous myths and ineffective treatments. The secrecy required by religious restrictions meant that women couldn't openly discuss methods or learn from each other's experiences. The male contraceptive methods were equally bizarre and ineffective. Men were advised to tie their left testicle with string, wear amulets made from specific animal parts, or consume various herbs that were supposed to reduce fertility. Some believed that having sex while standing up, during specific phases of the moon, or while thinking pure thoughts would prevent pregnancy. These methods had the advantage of being less physically dangerous than women's methods, but they were also completely useless. The barrier methods used in medieval times were crude but occasionally effective. Women would insert pieces of cloth, animal membranes, or carved objects into their vaginas to block sperm, creating primitive versions of diaphragms and cervical caps. While these methods were less toxic than herbal remedies, they often caused infections, tears, and other injuries due to poor materials and lack of sterile conditions. Some women used hollowed-out citrus fruits as cervical caps, which actually had some contraceptive effect due to the acidic environment they created. The timing methods were based on completely incorrect understanding of female fertility cycles. Medieval medical authorities believed that women were most fertile immediately before and after menstruation, which is exactly opposite to biological reality. This meant that couples who tried to time intercourse to avoid pregnancy were actually timing it to maximize their chances of conception. The misinformation was so widespread that it persisted for centuries, making natural family planning completely ineffective. Historians still argue whether medieval contraceptive practices were primarily about family planning or about women's attempts to control their own bodies in a system that gave them no other autonomy. The evidence suggests both motivations were important. Some women used contraception to space pregnancies for health reasons, while others used it as a form of resistance against forced reproduction. The social consequences of contraceptive use were severe when discovered. Women who were caught using birth control methods could face accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy. The church taught that preventing pregnancy was interfering with God's will, making contraception not just medically dangerous but spiritually damning. This created enormous psychological pressure on women who felt they had no choice but to risk their souls to protect their bodies. The economic factors driving contraceptive use were often desperate. Families who couldn't afford to feed additional children would risk dangerous methods rather than face starvation. Women whose health had been damaged by previous pregnancies would choose potentially fatal contraception over certainly dangerous childbirth. The calculations were brutal, but rational given the limited options available. The most tragic aspect was how the dangerous and ineffective nature of medieval contraception created cycles of desperation and risk-taking that could destroy entire families. A woman who survived one dangerous contraceptive attempt might be encouraged to try even more extreme methods, escalating the risks with each pregnancy scare. The lack of reliable, safe options meant that family planning was essentially a form of Russian roulette that women played repeatedly throughout their reproductive years. The knowledge transmission patterns were also problematic, as contraceptive information was passed down through informal networks of women who had no way to verify the safety or effectiveness of their methods. Successful pregnancies were attributed to divine will, while successful contraception was credited to whatever method had been used, creating false correlations that perpetuated dangerous practices. The secrecy required by religious prohibition meant that women couldn't openly study or improve their method. You're standing in a medieval marketplace in the year 1400, watching a young woman boldly refuse a marriage proposal her father arranged. And instead of being dragged away by force, she's actually being listened to. Something has shifted in the centuries since marriage was nothing more than livestock trading. And while the changes are small and fragile, they represent the first cracks in a system that seemed unbreakable. The evolution of medieval marriage wasn't a sudden revolution, but a slow, grinding process of resistance, economic change, and gradual recognition that maybe, just maybe, women were human beings deserving of some basic consideration in the most important decisions of their lives. The transformation began with economic necessity rather than moral enlightenment. As medieval society became more complex and urbanized, families discovered that marriages based purely on political or economic calculation often failed to produce the practical cooperation needed for successful households and businesses. A wife who was completely miserable might refuse to work effectively, fail to manage household affairs properly, or even sabotage family enterprises. Gradually, some families began to realize that a degree of compatibility between spouses wasn't just nice to have. It was economically essential. The rise of merchant classes created new marriage patterns that differed significantly from both noble political alliances and peasant survival arrangements. Merchant families needed marriages that could support complex business relationships, requiring spouses who could work together, represent the family's interests competently, and maintain the social connections essential for trade. This led to longer courtship periods, more consideration of personal compatibility, and gradually, some recognition that the bride's opinions might actually matter for the marriage's success. Here's where the changes get particularly interesting. The development of romantic literature and courtly love traditions, while initially focused on extramarital relationships, gradually began to influence expectations about marriage itself. The idea that love and affection might be desirable in marriage, previously considered dangerous and disruptive, slowly gained acceptance among some social groups. This wasn't a sudden shift toward modern romantic ideals, but rather a grudging acknowledgement that emotional compatibility might serve practical purposes. The Church's role in marriage evolution was complex and contradictory. While religious authorities maintained strict control over marriage law and continued to emphasize submission and duty, some church leaders began to argue that marriages based on mutual affection were more likely to be spiritually successful. The concept of marriage as a partnership in spiritual development, rather than just a legal contract, created space for arguments about the importance of compatibility and even limited forms of consent. Legal changes occurred slowly and unevenly across different regions, but they gradually expanded the circumstances under which marriages could be annulled or dissolved. While divorce remained impossible, the grounds for annulment were sometimes interpreted more liberally, particularly in cases involving extreme abuse or complete incompatibility. These changes were often driven by practical concerns. Communities didn't want to deal with the social disruption caused by completely dysfunctional marriages. The plague's demographic impact had lasting effects beyond the immediate crisis period. The labor shortages and social disruption of the 14th century created precedents for women's economic participation that couldn't be completely erased when traditional patterns were restored. Some women retained property rights, business interests, or social positions that gave them more leverage in marriage negotiations than their predecessors had possessed. The development of more sophisticated legal instruments allowed wealthy families to create marriage contracts that provided some protections for wives, even within the constraints of coverture laws. While these arrangements were available only to the wealthy and were often more theoretical than practical, they established precedents for the idea that wives might have some independent legal interests worth protecting. Historians still argue whether these medieval changes represented genuine progress toward gender equality or simply modifications to a fundamentally oppressive system. The evidence suggests that while the basic structure of male dominance remained intact, the specific mechanisms of control became somewhat less absolute and more negotiable for some women in some circumstances. The resistance strategies developed by medieval women created networks of knowledge and support that persisted across generations. Women who had successfully negotiated better marriage terms, escaped unwanted unions, or maintained some independence within marriage passed their strategies to daughters and other female relatives. This created an underground tradition of female agency that would eventually contribute to larger social changes. The most significant long-term impact was the gradual recognition that marriage arrangements had practical consequences that extended beyond the immediate families involved. Communities began to understand that completely dysfunctional marriages created social problems, domestic violence, economic instability, child welfare issues that affected everyone. This led to slowly increasing acceptance of the idea that some consideration of the couple's compatibility might serve broader social interests. The changes were fragile and easily reversed during periods of social stress or conservative reaction. Many of the gains made during periods of economic prosperity or social disruption were lost when traditional authorities reasserted control. But each cycle of change and reaction left some residual progress, creating a slow but persistent trend toward recognition of women's humanity and agency. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the medieval marriage system that seemed so permanent and unbreakable was actually constantly evolving, shaped by the resistance of countless women whose names we'll never know but whose courage slowly chipped away at centuries of oppression. The changes were small, often temporary, and always incomplete, but they represented the beginning of a long journey toward the recognition that marriage should be a partnership between equals rather than a transfer of property between men. The women who refused unwanted marriages, who negotiated for better terms, who found ways to maintain some independence within oppressive systems. They were the ones who began the slow work of transforming marriage from a form of legalized slavery into something that might eventually resemble love. Sweet dreams, and remember that even the most entrenched systems of oppression can be changed by ordinary people who refuse to accept that things must always be as they have been. The medieval women who fought for tiny scraps of agency and dignity were the ancestors of every person who has ever insisted that love should matter more than politics, that consent should matter more than convenience, and that human beings deserve to have some say in the most important decisions of their lives. Sweet dreams, you're kneeling in the confessional, whispering to the priest about your marital relations, and he's taking notes. Not metaphorical notes, actual written records of when, how, and in what positions you and your spouse have been intimate. The church didn't just control your soul, it controlled your bedroom, your body, and every aspect of your physical relationship, with a level of micromanagement that would make modern surveillance states jealous. Welcome to medieval marriage, where even your most private moments were subject to religious regulation and bureaucratic oversight. The Catholic Church's control over marital intimacy was absolute and terrifyingly detailed. Church doctrine specified not just when couples could have sex, but how they should do it, what positions were acceptable, and what thoughts they were allowed to have during the act. The missionary position wasn't just a preference. It was often the only church-approved method of intercourse, with other positions considered sinful variations that could damn your soul to hell. The calendar of forbidden days was extensive enough to make intimacy a rare occurrence. Couples couldn't have sex during Lent, Advent, or any of the numerous feast days scattered throughout the year. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays were generally off-limits, as were the days before receiving communion. Menstruation made intimacy sinful, as did pregnancy after the first few months. When you added up all the prohibited times, many couples had only a few dozen days per year when marital relations were considered spiritually acceptable. Here's the part that'll make your skin crawl. The church required detailed confessions about marital intimacy, and priests were trained to ask specific questions about frequency, positions, and the couple's mental state during intercourse. These confessions were sometimes recorded, creating written documentation of medieval couples' most private moments. The information could be used against them in church courts, annulment proceedings, or community discipline cases. Your bedroom activities weren't just between you and your spouse. They were between you, your spouse, and the entire ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The church's obsession with controlling marital sexuality stemmed from its fundamental belief that physical pleasure was spiritually dangerous. Even within marriage, sex was only acceptable if it was performed for procreation, without excessive enjoyment, and with proper spiritual preparation. Couples were expected to pray before intimacy, maintain serious demeanors during the act, and confess afterward if they'd experienced too much pleasure. The idea that married people might enjoy physical intimacy was considered a sign of spiritual weakness that needed correction. Women bore the brunt of these restrictions, as church doctrine held them responsible for tempting their husbands into sinful behavior. A wife who initiated intimacy, expressed pleasure, or suggested variations was considered dangerously lustful and in need of spiritual discipline. The church taught that women's sexual desires were inherently more sinful than men's, making wives responsible for maintaining their husband's spiritual purity as well as their own. This created impossible double binds, where women were blamed for both refusing their husbands and for being too willing. The enforcement mechanisms were sophisticated and invasive. Parish priests would question couples separately about their intimate lives, looking for discrepancies that might indicate sinful behavior. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious activities, like couples who seemed too affectionate or who might be violating the calendar restrictions. Church courts could impose penances ranging from fasting and prayer to public humiliation and temporary separation for couples who violated the sexual regulations. Contraception was absolutely forbidden, but the church's definition was broader than you might expect. Any attempt to prevent pregnancy, including withdrawal, timing intercourse to avoid fertile periods, or using barrier methods, was considered a mortal sin equivalent to murder. Couples were expected to accept whatever children God chose to send them, regardless of their ability to feed, house, or care for additional offspring. Family planning was literally planning against God's will. The psychological impact of this religious surveillance was devastating. Couples learned to associate physical intimacy with guilt, fear, and potential punishment. The natural development of marital affection was stunted by constant worry about spiritual consequences. Many couples developed elaborate rituals of prayer and penance around their intimate lives, turning what should have been expressions of love into exercises in religious compliance. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were primarily about controlling sexuality or about maintaining church authority over all aspects of medieval life. The evidence suggests both motivations were important. Sexual control was a means to broader social control, and the intimate nature of the regulations made them particularly effective tools for demonstrating ecclesiastical power over individual lives. Some couples found ways to work around the restrictions, developing coded language for discussing intimacy or finding loopholes in the church's complex regulations. But resistance was dangerous, as accusations of sexual impropriety could lead to excommunication, social ostracism, or worse. Most couples simply accepted the church's authority over their bodies. In turn, you're standing in the town square watching a woman being dragged through the streets, her face bloodied and her clothes torn. The crowd cheers as her husband follows behind, carrying the stick he used to beat her, a stick no thicker than his thumb, which makes it perfectly legal under medieval law. This isn't a criminal being punished. This is a wife being corrected by her husband, and everyone watching considers it not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining proper social order. Medieval law didn't just permit domestic violence, it actively encouraged it as a husband's duty and right. The famous rule of thumb wasn't just a saying, it was actual legal doctrine that specified the maximum thickness of stick a man could use to beat his wife without facing legal consequences. Anything thicker was considered excessive, but anything thinner was fair game for maintaining household discipline. Your husband wasn't just allowed to hit you. Society expected him to do so whenever you stepped out of line. The legal framework surrounding marital violence was sophisticated and comprehensive. Church law, civil law, and social custom all aligned to create a system where wives had no legal protection from their husband's violence. A woman couldn't bring charges against her husband for assault because she was legally considered his property, and you can't assault your own property. The few legal remedies that existed required proof of violence so extreme that it threatened the wife's life. And even then, the usual remedy was temporary separation, not punishment for the husband. The justifications for this system were elaborate and deeply ingrained in medieval thinking. Religious authorities cited biblical passages about wives submitting to their husbands, arguing that physical correction was necessary to maintain the divine order of marriage. Legal scholars developed theories about the husband's responsibility to govern his household, which included the right to use force to ensure compliance. Social commentators praised husbands who kept their wives in line, while criticizing those who were too lenient as weak and unmanly. Here's what makes it even more horrifying. The violence wasn't just tolerated, it was systematized. Medieval advice manuals for husbands included detailed instructions on when and how to beat wives effectively. They recommended starting with verbal warnings, escalating to slaps and light blows, and only progressing to serious beatings for repeated offenses. The goal wasn't to injure permanently, but to establish dominance and ensure future compliance through fear. Women had virtually no recourse when faced with violent husbands. Running away was illegal and usually futile, as authorities would return runaway wives to their husbands, along with recommendations for harsher punishment to prevent future escapes. Seeking help from family members was often impossible, as many families viewed domestic violence as a private matter between husband and wife. Even the church, which claimed to protect the vulnerable, typically counseled wives to accept their suffering as penance for their sins. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the physical violence itself. Women lived in constant fear, never knowing what might trigger their husband's anger or how severe the punishment might be. This created a climate of terror that made genuine affection or partnership impossible. Many wives developed elaborate strategies for avoiding their husband's displeasure, walking on eggshells, and suppressing their own personalities to minimize the risk of violence. The community's role in enabling domestic violence was crucial to the system's effectiveness. Neighbors who witnessed beatings were expected to mind their own business, unless the violence was so extreme that it threatened to kill the wife. Even then, intervention was more about preventing murder than protecting the woman. Community members would often praise husbands for keeping their wives under control, treating domestic violence as a sign of proper household management rather than criminal behavior. Historians still argue whether medieval domestic violence was more severe than in other historical periods, or if it was simply more openly acknowledged and legally sanctioned. The evidence suggests both factors were important. The violence was both more extreme and more socially acceptable than in many other eras. The combination of legal permission, religious justification, and social approval created a perfect storm of sanctioned brutality. Some women found ways to resist or escape violent marriages, but their options were limited and dangerous. A few sought sanctuary in convents, though this required either significant dowry payments or proof of exceptional religious devotion. Others developed networks of female support that provided temporary refuge and practical assistance. The most desperate might resort to poisoning their husbands, though this carried the risk of execution if discovered. The economic dimensions of domestic violence were particularly cruel. Since wives couldn't own property or earn independent income, They were completely dependent on their husbands for survival. This economic vulnerability made it nearly impossible to leave violent marriages, even when legal separation was theoretically possible. A woman who left her husband faced not just social disgrace, but potential starvation, as she had no legal means of supporting herself. The impact on children was devastating and long-lasting. Children who grew up witnessing domestic violence learned that this was normal behavior in marriage, perpetuating cycles of abuse across generations. Boys learned that violence was an acceptable way to control women, while girls learned to expect and accept brutality as part of married life. The psychological damage extended far beyond the immediate victims to shape entire communities' understanding of appropriate relationships. The most tragic aspect was how the system convinced many women that they deserved the violence they suffered. Religious teachings about women's inherent sinfulness, combined with social messages about wives' duties to submit and obey, created internalized guilt that made women blame themselves for their husband's violence. This psychological manipulation was perhaps more damaging than the physical "you're pregnant again," and the midwife's expression tells you everything you need to know. She's seen too many women die in childbirth, and she's already preparing your family for the possibility that this baby might be your last. In medieval times, pregnancy wasn't a joyful anticipation of new life. It was a death sentence that might be delayed by luck, prayer, or the rare competent midwife. 1 in 3 women died during pregnancy or childbirth, making motherhood literally the most dangerous profession in medieval society. The statistics are staggering and heartbreaking. Maternal mortality rates in medieval Europe ranged from 20 to 40%, meaning that every pregnancy was essentially a coin flip with death. These weren't just numbers in church records. They represented millions of women who died in agony, leaving behind grieving families and motherless children. The phrase "died in childbed" appeared so frequently in medieval documents that it became a standard cause of death, as common and unremarkable as disease or old age. The medical understanding of pregnancy and childbirth was not just primitive, it was actively harmful. Medieval physicians believed that women's bodies were fundamentally flawed versions of men's bodies, with reproductive organs that were essentially inverted male genitalia. This led to treatments that were based on completely incorrect anatomical understanding. Doctors would prescribe bloodletting for pregnant women, believing it would balance their humors, when in reality it weakened them at the time they most needed strength. Here's where medieval medicine gets particularly horrifying. The standard treatments for difficult labor often killed more women than they saved. Midwives would use crude instruments to try to extract stuck babies, frequently causing massive internal injuries. They'd give women ergot-based drugs to speed up labor, not realizing that ergot poisoning could cause convulsions and death. Some practitioners would literally shake pregnant women or hang them upside down, believing this would help position the baby correctly. The church's influence on childbirth was both pervasive and deadly. Religious doctrine taught that women's pain in childbirth was divine punishment for Eve's sin, making pain relief not just medically unavailable but morally forbidden. Women were expected to suffer through labor as penance, and those who cried out too loudly were sometimes accused of lacking proper Christian submission. Prayer was considered more effective than medical intervention, leading families to delay seeking help until it was too late. Hygiene during childbirth was virtually non-existent, creating perfect conditions for infection and death. Midwives rarely washed their hands or instruments, moving from patient to patient and spreading disease. The concept of sterile environments was unknown, so births typically took place in rooms filled with family members, neighbors, and various attendants, all contributing to the bacterial load that could kill new mothers through puerperal fever. The social pressure to produce male heirs made pregnancy even more dangerous. Women who failed to produce sons faced blame, punishment, and sometimes abandonment, creating enormous stress that could complicate pregnancies. Some women would attempt dangerous folk remedies to influence their baby's gender, consuming toxic herbs or subjecting themselves to harmful rituals that increased the risk of miscarriage or maternal death. Multiple pregnancies were the norm rather than the exception, as contraception was forbidden and family planning was considered sinful. Women might face 10, 12, or even 15 pregnancies during their reproductive years, with each one carrying the same terrifying mortality risk. The cumulative effect was that most women who survived to menopause had lost at least one child and had come close to death multiple times themselves. The economic impact of maternal mortality was devastating for families and communities. When women died in childbirth, they left behind not just grieving husbands and orphaned children, but economic disasters. Women's labor was essential to medieval households, and their sudden death could plunge families into poverty. Widowed men with young children faced impossible choices between remarrying quickly or watching their households collapse. Historians still argue whether medieval maternal mortality rates were higher than in other pre-modern societies, or if better record-keeping simply made the deaths more visible. The evidence suggests that medieval Europe's combination of poor medical knowledge, religious restrictions on pain relief, and unsanitary conditions created particularly deadly circumstances for pregnant women. Some women tried to improve their chances by seeking out the most experienced midwives, paying for better care, or traveling to locations known for skilled practitioners. But even the best medieval obstetric care was primitive by modern standards, and wealth could only do so much to overcome the fundamental limitations of medieval medicine. Rich women died in childbirth almost as frequently as poor women, though they might have slightly better access to pain-relieving drugs or more comfortable surroundings for their final hours. The psychological impact on surviving women was enormous. Every pregnancy brought not just the hope of a new child, but the very real possibility of death. Women would write wills before giving birth, arrange for the care of their existing children, and essentially prepare for their own funerals. This constant proximity to death shaped medieval women's entire relationship with motherhood, making what should have been joyful occasions into exercises in terror and preparation for the worst. The ripple effects extended to entire communities, as high maternal mortality rates meant that many children grew up without mothers. Many men became widowers multiple times, and the general population lived with the constant awareness that pregnancy was a form of Russian roulette. The phrase "God willing" wasn't just religious expression. It was a genuine acknowledgement that survival through childbirth required divine intervention, because human medicine certainly wasn't up to the task. You're 16 years old, and you've just been told you're going to marry a 60-year-old man with rotting teeth and hands that shake from too much wine. But you have a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan that might be your only escape from a lifetime of misery. You're going to mutilate yourself, claim divine visions, or fake a deadly illness, because in medieval society, these were sometimes the only ways a woman could avoid an unwanted marriage. Welcome to the underground world of marriage resistance, where desperate women used everything from self-harm to religious fraud to escape the matrimonial trap. The most extreme form of resistance was deliberate self-mutilation, and it was more common than you might think. Young women would cut their faces, burn their skin with acid, or deliberately break their own bones to make themselves unmarriageable. The logic was brutal but effective. If you were physically damaged, your market value as a bride plummeted, and families might abandon their marriage plans rather than accept reduced dowry payments. Some women would cut off their own noses or ears, knowing that facial disfigurement would make them undesirable to potential husbands. Religious visions were another popular escape route, though they required considerable acting skill and knowledge of church doctrine. A woman who claimed to have received divine revelations calling her to religious life could sometimes convince her family to abandon marriage plans in favor of sending her to a convent. The key was making the visions convincing enough to fool local clergy, while dramatic enough to override family economic interests. Some women spent months preparing elaborate stories of divine encounters, complete with specific details about saints, angels, and religious symbolism. Faking illness was perhaps the most common form of resistance, and medieval women became remarkably skilled at simulating symptoms that would make marriage impossible or inadvisable. Epilepsy was particularly effective, as it was considered both spiritually significant and potentially hereditary, making women unsuitable for producing healthy heirs. Some women would induce seizures using various herbs, or would simply become expert at theatrical convulsions that convinced observers of their affliction. Here's where it gets particularly clever. Some women would claim to be possessed by demons, knowing that exorcism procedures could take months or years and would make them unmarriageable during the process. Demonic possession required extensive investigation by church authorities, during which time marriage negotiations would be suspended. The symptoms were relatively easy to fake: speaking in tongues, violent convulsions, and claims of supernatural knowledge. And the process of investigation and treatment could delay unwanted marriages indefinitely. The most sophisticated resistance involved eloping with chosen partners, though this was extremely dangerous and rarely successful. Women who ran away with men of their own choosing faced excommunication, disinheritance, and potential death sentences if caught. But some were desperate enough to risk everything for the chance at a marriage based on affection rather than economic calculation. These elopements required careful planning, trusted accomplices, and usually involved fleeing to distant locations where the couple's identities weren't known. Some women used pregnancy as a resistance strategy, deliberately becoming pregnant by men they preferred in order to force different marriage arrangements. This was incredibly risky, as unmarried pregnancy could lead to severe punishment or death. But it sometimes worked if the woman could convince her family that marriage to the baby's father was preferable to the scandal of an illegitimate child. The timing had to be perfect, and the chosen man had to be willing to marry her despite the circumstances. Legal resistance was possible but extremely difficult, requiring women to prove that their proposed marriages violated church law in some way. Some women would research their intended husband's family histories, looking for evidence of blood relationships that would make the marriage incestuous and therefore invalid. Others would claim prior contracts or secret marriages that would prevent new unions. These legal challenges required knowledge, resources, and access to church courts that most women simply didn't have. The most heartbreaking form of resistance was suicide, and medieval records show that some young women chose death rather than forced marriage. These weren't impulsive decisions but carefully planned escapes from situations that seemed worse than death. Some women would throw themselves from high places, others would poison themselves, and a few would deliberately provoke fatal accidents. The church condemned suicide as mortal sin, but for some women, eternal damnation seemed preferable to earthly marriage. Historians still argue whether these resistance strategies were primarily about avoiding specific unwanted marriages or about rejecting the entire system of arranged marriage. The evidence suggests both motivations were common. Some women were trying to escape particularly horrible situations, while others were rebelling against the fundamental lack of choice in their lives. Family reactions to resistance varied widely. Some parents would respond with increased violence and coercion, essentially imprisoning their daughters until they agreed to marry. Others would seek compromises, perhaps arranging different marriages or agreeing to delays. A few families would actually listen to their daughters' objections and reconsider their plans, though this was rare and usually only happened when the economic stakes were relatively low. The success rate of resistance strategies was generally low, and the consequences of failure were severe. Women who were caught attempting to escape marriages faced punishment that could include beating, imprisonment, forced marriage under even worse conditions, or exile from their families. The risks were enormous, but for some women, the alternative of accepting unwanted marriage seemed even worse. The psychological toll of resistance was enormous, whether successful or not. Women who successfully avoided unwanted marriages often faced lifelong consequences in terms of social isolation, economic hardship, and family rejection. Those who failed faced not just the original unwanted marriage, but additional punishment and surveillance that made future resistance nearly impossible. The system was designed to crush individual will, and even successful resistance often came at a devastating personal cost. You've discovered that your husband has been sleeping with the baker's wife for months, and you're facing a choice that could literally kill you. In medieval society, adultery wasn't just morally wrong. It was a crime with vastly different punishments depending on your gender. If you're the unfaithful wife, you might face death by stoning, burning, or drowning. If you're the cheated-on wife seeking divorce, you're about to learn that the word divorce doesn't exist in medieval vocabulary, and your only escape route is the nearly impossible process of annulment. Medieval marriage was designed to be permanent, and the church's position on divorce was absolute. What God had joined together, no human authority could separate. This wasn't just religious doctrine. It was legal reality that trapped millions of people in marriages that ranged from merely unhappy to actively dangerous. The concept of divorce as we understand it today simply didn't exist. Marriage was a sacrament like baptism, and just as you couldn't become unbaptized, you couldn't become unmarried. Annulment was the only legal escape route, but it required proving that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. This was a legal and theological minefield that required extensive knowledge, significant financial resources, and usually years of legal proceedings. The grounds for annulment were strictly limited: non-consummation, blood relationship within forbidden degrees, prior existing marriage, coercion so extreme that consent was impossible, or one party being below the canonical age at the time of marriage. Here's where the system gets particularly cruel. Proving non-consummation required intimate testimony that was both humiliating and often impossible to provide. Women had to submit to physical examinations by church-appointed experts who would determine whether they were still virgins. These examinations were conducted by panels of older women, often in front of church officials, and the results were recorded in legal documents that became part of the public record. The process was so degrading that many women preferred to remain in unhappy marriages rather than subject themselves to this humiliation. Proving blood relationship required genealogical research that was often impossible for ordinary people to conduct. The church prohibited marriage between relatives within 7 degrees of relationship, which meant that many marriages could theoretically be annulled if sufficient research was done. But tracing family lines back several generations required access to records that most people didn't have, and the process could take years and cost enormous amounts of money. The double standard for adultery was breathtaking in its injustice. A man who committed adultery might face mild church penance, perhaps some extra prayers or a small fine. A woman who committed adultery faced potential death sentences, public humiliation, and permanent social ostracism. The reasoning was that female adultery threatened the legitimacy of inheritance, while male adultery was considered a relatively minor moral failing that didn't threaten social order. Some regions had particularly creative punishments for adulterous women. In parts of France, unfaithful wives might be forced to run naked through the streets while being pelted with stones and garbage. In Germanic regions, adulterous women could be drowned in rivers or buried alive. Italian city-states sometimes required adulterous women to wear distinctive clothing that marked them as sexual criminals for the rest of their lives. The legal proceedings for annulment were deliberately complex and expensive, designed to discourage all but the most determined or wealthy petitioners. Church courts required extensive documentation, multiple witnesses, and often years of testimony. The process could bankrupt entire families, and there was no guarantee of success, even after enormous investments of time and money. Many people who started annulment proceedings had to abandon them due to financial exhaustion. Historians still argue whether the church's strict position on marriage dissolution was primarily about theological principle or about maintaining social control. The evidence suggests both factors were important. The church genuinely believed in the sacramental nature of marriage, but also recognized that easy divorce would undermine the entire social system that depended on stable family alliances and property transfers. Some couples found creative ways around the divorce prohibition. They might arrange mutual accusations of adultery, hoping that both parties would be punished in ways that effectively ended the marriage. Others would conspire to fake evidence of blood relationship or prior contracts. These strategies were risky and often unsuccessful, but they represented desperate attempts to escape intolerable situations. The economic implications of the no-divorce rule were enormous. Women who were abandoned by their husbands couldn't remarry and had no legal means of supporting themselves. Men who wanted to escape marriages were sometimes forced to abandon their property and flee to distant locations, where they could start new lives under false identities. The system created a class of legal limbo dwellers who were neither married nor single, neither free nor fully constrained. The psychological impact of permanent marriage was devastating for people trapped in abusive or incompatible relationships. Knowing that there was no legal escape created despair that could last decades. Some people developed elaborate fantasy lives or turned to alcohol, religion, or extramarital affairs as coping mechanisms. Others simply resigned themselves to misery, viewing their unhappy marriages as divine punishment for unknown sins. The most tragic cases involved marriages where one spouse became violently insane or developed conditions that made cohabitation